right. Um, we've been talking when we last met about properties of life, and all life as we know it, to the best of our knowledge, is composed primarily of six chemical elements. The good old schnapps, those combine together to make extremely complicated large structures called macromolecules. And for reasons we don't need to get into, those six elements happen to be very good at making extremely large, complex structures. All truly living things that we know of are made of little subunits called cells, um, have a metabolism, adjust their internal environment to maintain stable conditions inside so that their metabolism can run, sense and respond to the environment. Populations change over time, and all living organisms interact with each other in complicated ways. One final property of life is that it comes in an absolutely ridiculous number of different varieties. If you look at just the mammals, that's organisms with a backbone, hair, feeding their babies with milk, diaphragm separating the chest from the abdomen, various other features, teeth of different shapes, like your incisors and canines and molars, all those things. There's roughly 5,500 mammal species known in the world, the majority of which are either rodents or bats. But this, of course, includes, carnivores like dogs and cats, and hoofed mammals, and whales, and dolphins, and primates, including humans, too. There's roughly 10,000 species of bird that we know about, 25,000 or so species of fish, everything from sharks to bass and bluegills to swordfish, everything in between. Insects are the ones that go crazy. There's nearly 1 million known species of insect. And roughly we have about 1.8 million known species of animal, plant, protist, and fungus, creeping up on 2 million. The actual number that's present on the globe, we don't actually know because we keep finding new ones. You might think that even, we've explored the planet so much that there isn't anything new to find, but we discover something on the order of 10,000 new species of animal, plant, protist, and fungus each year. By the way, I'm throwing the term around species. We'll get to a better definition of this later. For the moment, I'm just going to be a little bit vague and call a species a basic type of living thing, a basic variety of living thing. That's actually a terrible definition, but we will replace that with a better one once I've gone over a little bit more material. And let's see here. To make matters worse, we keep discovering, is there a way I can hide that toolbar? There we go. To make matters worse, okay, it's 18,000 new species of living thing are discovered and described each year. Just a few recent ones. That was an amphibian that was documented from Vietnam back in 2024. It's related to salamanders, but it has those funny bumps on its head. It's affectionately known as the crocodile newt. And who knows how long it had been around, but nobody realized it was there until it was found and officially described in 2024. That blob-headed catfish turned up in a remote part of Peru in 2022. In 2023, the half-inch long pygmy squid was found living in seagrass beds on the Ryukyu Islands off the coast of Japan. And we continue to find new species every year and have to describe them, define them, and name them. So the best rough estimate of how many total species there are on the planet, it's very hard to count something when you don't know how many things there are. That actually sounded more profound in my head than it probably seems to you. But our best guess using some statistical arm waving is about 8.7 million species. If that's right, we know less than a quarter of all of the diversity of life that's out there. And that might raise questions like why? Why should there be so many different varieties of living thing? What is there about this diversity? Why not just 100? Why so much? More practically, perhaps, how do we keep track of all of it? Well, a lot of species have common names in English, but many of these don't because we don't know about them or we've never seen them before. And even in American English, you can have one species of animal might end up with multiple names. Anybody familiar with this fish? Okay, some of you might call it, or maybe your papa calls it bluegill. Anybody heard of bluegills? Okay. Anybody call it brim? Okay, my dad, when he took me fishing when I was quite little, his word for this was a brim. Some people call it a bluegill. Some people call it a perch. Some people call it sunfish. Some people call it panfish. There's about 5 different names you could apply. Just do that thing, which is happily swimming around as we speak in many of the lakes of Arkansas. It is a popular fish for fishing because it puts up a good fight and it tastes pretty good pan fried. And we have about 5 different names for it just in American English. So do we call it bluegill, sunfish, perch, or brim, or panfish? What is it? Some people would call that a sunfish, but sometimes the same name in English can apply to very different species because sunfish can also mean a fish called the ocean sunfish, which looks like that. The ocean sunfish is huge. You might be able to see the silhouette of a person standing by the tank. So that thing's about 6 feet wide and basically looks like an amputated fish head that is more or less missing its tail and just has a single pair of large fins. Yeah, that is a real thing. It's the ocean sunfish. And if I say, hey, I'm studying sunfish, how do you know which one I'm talking about? What makes it more difficult is that common names aren't necessarily stable. The fish up there at the top looks kind of weird, but in fact is quite delicious. And in the 1970s, it started getting exploited, started getting fished in the North Atlantic. And you can buy fillets of it in Kroger today. Little expensive, but it tastes pretty good. And they marketed the fish under the name Orange Ruffy. And, go to the bougie Kroger up on Salem, and you can probably find Orange Ruffy fillets on any given day, frozen or fresh. But that's entirely a marketing name. Before that fish started getting marketed in the 70s, it was referred to, when anybody referred to it at all, as the Atlantic slimehead. And people decided that nobody was going to buy slimehead fillets. Nobody in a restaurant is going to order the fillet of slimehead in hollandaise sauce. So the name was changed purely to market the fish better. For the same reason, the fruit down below is native to China. It was grown a lot in New Zealand, and beginning in 1959, New Zealand fruit growers started exporting and marketing that fruit to the United States under the name kiwi fruit. Before the marketers came up with it, that fruit had been known as the Chinese gooseberry. Now, I'd eat gooseberries faster than I would eat slime heads. But either way, the point is that the common names that we call species in English are always prone to shifting, sometimes just because languages change, and sometimes because of marketing decisions. It gets worse when you have to communicate with English speakers from other countries. There are other countries that speak perfectly good English, but they have some different vocabulary for different things. Sorry, I'm just reminded of the time I got picked up at the train station in Aberdeen, Scotland, by somebody who was giving me a ride in his car, who told me that after dropping me off, he was going to pick up some fags and then go knock someone up. What he meant was he was going to pick up some cigarettes and then go knock on somebody's door to wake them up. In American English, those words have quite different meanings. And the same is true for living species. On the left is what we call a robin. That's a bird we kind of associate with spring. In the middle is a European robin, which is actually quite active in the winter. British people like putting those robins on their Christmas cards. They're seen as kind of a Christmassy symbol, I guess the way holly is. And then in Australia, that's what they call a robin there on the right. And they all do have red on the chest. Other than that, they're not really that similar. They've got different habitats, different food preferences, different details of their anatomy, of their shape, of their skeleton, things like that. They're quite different species. And yet in English, they all can be called robin depending on what country you're from. And clearly this is a problem if you have to work with scientists from other countries and you're studying birds and you mentioned that you found something out about robins. Well, which robin were you talking about? By the way, Disney royally screwed this up in Mary Poppins. You've heard of this, right? Disney, right? Disney movie. You probably watched it 1,000 times when you were kids. It's set in London in 1910, but there's Mary Poppins in the musical number. You know this one? Just a spoonful of sugar helps the medicine go down. Disney movie. You've seen it, right?
I did.
Okay, all right. Okay, this is a long time before they did like the Lion King and stuff like that. The medicine go down, the medicine go down. And she's got this bit where she sings to this robin. A robin feathering his nest has very little time to rest while gathering his bits of twine and twig. And Disney screwed this up because she's singing to an American robin, which you'd almost never see in the UK. You never see these guys in Britain, except very occasionally one will get lost and end up there. So I've actually met a couple of British people who were a little bit salty about that. And it gets even worse when you remember that there's actually other countries in the world and they don't all speak English. For some people, that comes as a bit of a shock, but it's true. Science is collaborative. Very few discoveries these days are really made by the lone genius locked up in his laboratory late at night. We collaborate with people from all over the globe. And species may have very different names in different languages. So if you're French, that's a crape arlequin. If you speak Spanish, that's a mojarra oreja azul or azul. If you're Polish, that's a bas niebieski. If you're Russian, that's a Sinye Jabrny Solnichnik. Yes, I looked that up. It's Burugiru in Japanese and Bloyal Sonnenbausch in German and Nunibusa in Choctaw. So what is it really? Well, it's a fish. It doesn't, the fish knows perfectly well what it is, but how can we figure out what we're calling it? If Dr. Adams in our department, Dr. Reed Adams, our big fish guy, goes to an international conference and he talks about work that he's done on this fish, how does he communicate his findings to an audience that might include a lot of people from countries that don't speak English at all? Well, the solution we've hit upon was first developed by a guy by the name of Carl Linnaeus. He was Swedish. He was a physician, and he had an ego that would not fit through a revolving door. Linnaeus saw himself quite literally, quite unironically, as being on a mission from God. He had a divine mission to study all of nature and figure out how to classify it, figure out how to group all of these species into groupings such that only species that were really, truly similar got grouped together, and species that really weren't similar didn't get grouped together. And the idea is if you can organize all of this diversity and classify it and come up with a really good scheme for putting it into groups and subgroups and sub-subgroups, you'd get inside God's head. You would be able to understand as much as any human could understand what God had been thinking when he created all of this mess. You'd be able to get inside God's personal filing cabinet. And that doesn't sound very modest, but like I said, Linnaeus was not suffering from a lack of self-esteem. That's actually a quote where Linnaeus was writing about himself in the third person. God has allowed him to see more of his created work than any mortal before him. God has endowed him with the greatest insight into natural knowledge. Yeah, like I said, ego that you couldn't fit in the average elevator. But quite aside from Linnaeus's massive ego, there was a practical reason as well for classifying all of this stuff. Linnaeus was a physician. He was a doctor, and he taught at the medical school of the University of Uppsala in Sweden. And medical schools at the time had big botanical gardens. This is what the one at Uppsala looked like at the time Linnaeus was there. Lots of plants growing there, and every doctor had to learn botany. Every doctor had to learn about plants. Guess why? Why would doctors need to know anything about plants? Yeah, most medicine at the time was derived from plants. I mean, a lot of it still is, as we'll see towards the very end of the course. But most medicines at the time were derived from plants. This is the age when Europeans are exploring Africa and Asia and the Americas and meeting all sorts of fascinating people and killing them and enslaving them. But let's not get into that. But also discovering a lot of new plants, many of which are turning out to be medicinal. So there's this huge explosion in the number of plant species we know. A lot of them are important as medicines. And if you're a doctor and you give your patient the wrong medicine, if you misidentify your plant and you give them the wrong herbal medicine, your patient's not going to get better. Your patient might well end up with a slight case of the death, right? So you have to come up with some practical way of organizing all of your knowledge of this biological diversity. You've got to come up with a way to classify your plants just so you can look them up when you need to, and you can identify them most easily. So for both ego boost and the practical needs of the medical profession, Linnaeus went back to the philosopher Aristotle. And Aristotle had classified things in two ways. He said, if you've got a group of things, you start by finding the ways in which all members of that group are similar, all of the things that the members of the group have in common. And you call that their genus. And then you look at each member of the genus and you figure out what makes each member of the genus different from all other members. And you call that the species. So there's Aristotle himself. He is in the genus humanity. I said man, but not just males, humanity, because he shares features in common with just about all other members of humanity. He's got two eyes, he's got one nose, he's got two ears, etc. His species is the fact that he's got a bald spot with a comb over. He's got a beard. He's got a pretty big nose. He goes around philosophizing at people. He once served as the philosophy teacher of Alexander of Macedonia before Alexander decided he'd rather conquer the world than understand it and became known as Alexander the Great. All of the things about Aristotle that make him different from any other human would make up his species. All of the things that he shares in common with all other humans would be his genus. So Linnaeus borrows that and starts looking at plants. And he applies it to animals too, but plants were what he was mostly focused on. He said, look at these. These are all recognizably roses. They've got similar petals, similar scents, similarly shaped flowers, similarly shaped fruits, similar leaves. And as hair metal taught us back when I was a teenager, they're also similar because every rose has its thorn. And none of you recognize that. What has education come to when we are no longer teaching our children the classics of Western culture? Anyway. Yeah, they've all got similar thorns and all that. Clearly, they're all roses. And yet each one is distinct from the others. There are ways in which each one represents a different type of rose. And so we can put all three of these into one genus because they're all roses and they've got thorns and leaf shape and petal shape and so on in common. And then we can divide that genus into three species corresponding to the differences that each one has from the other two. And again, I'm being a little bit vague as to exactly what species means here in the biological sense, but we will get to that a little bit later. So if that seems fuzzy, all will become clear. So Linnaeus's first thing was coming up with a naming system called biological nomenclature. All species, he said, should have standardized two-part Latin names. One word for the genus followed by one word for the species. So all three of these roses are in genus Rosa, but on the left we have Rosa canina. In the middle, that's Rosa gallica. And on the right, Rosa grandiflora. It works much the same way that your name does. Except the order of elements is reversed. My last name is Wagoner, and I share that with a bunch of people that are related to me. Yes, right? So that would be like my genus name. And my species name, Ben, if you must know Benjamin Martin, full name, distinguishes me from Roger Allen Wagoner, my dad, or Joseph Martin Wagoner, my grandfather, or Glenn Wallace Wagoner, my uncle who lived in Dallas and worked in a hospital, or Richard Wagoner, my other uncle who was a church organist, or Andrew Wagoner, my cousin who is a composer of very modern sounding classical music at Duke University, and so on. So Wagoner would be our genus here because it groups us together by family descent, which is what we have in common. And then our first names distinguish which member of the Wagoner family that you've got. It works much like this, except we reverse the order. So we'd actually be putting the last name first, like they do in Hungary. So Rosa is the genus because these are all roses, and then grandiflora tells you which species it is within that genus. That has the advantage of being short. That has the advantage of being standardized. What botanists had used before was very long descriptions in Latin. So that plant would be known, but to at least some, as Rosa sylvestris alba cum rubore folio glabro. That's a mouthful. It means rose of the forest, white with a red blush, smooth leaves. It's basically a description. And it wasn't standardized because people, two people would not necessarily describe the same plant in exactly the same way. And so that's been replaced by Rosa canina. Okay, a lot shorter, a lot easier to remember, and by international agreement, standardized. Names are still okay. There's a bunch of extremely boring rules called the International Code of Zoological Nomenclature. It's not really a code of law. Nothing says you can't call this thing a brim or a Sinjejabrny Solnichnik or a Basnibieski or anything else that you want. You could make up your own name for it and call it a Glock or, whatever. But the scientific community has basically agreed on a set of rules that mean that these names cannot be changed except under a very limited set of circumstances. We all use them pretty much just by all agreeing to use them. They're in Latin, by the way, because when Linnaeus was working, Latin was the international language of scholars, the international language of educated people. If you'd been to a university, you knew Latin. You were expected to. Times have changed, of course, but Latin is now used because it's not the language of any. I guess technically it's the language of the Vatican City, and it still is used a little bit within the Roman Catholic Church, but it's not the language of a superpower. There's no political heft attached to it. If names had to be in English, then the Chinese might object. If names had to be in Chinese, then the Americans might object. Latin, not being a living language and not spoken by any major country, is neutral. Basically, it means, all scientists are starting from the same starting point. Nobody's got an advantage because they're native speakers of Latin. Incidentally, when we write these, you always put the name in italics, you capitalize the genus name, and you never capitalize the species name. So when we have to talk about fish, we don't call this a bluegill or a Bleuel Sonnenbausch or what have you. This is Lepomus macrochirus. Lepomus is a genus of American sunfish. There's something like 11 different species of Lepomus. And the specific species right there is Lepomus macrochirus. And that's what Dr. Reed Adams is going to use if he talks about his research to people from anywhere else. That solves our robin problem. The American robin is Turdus migratorius. The European robin is Erythacus rubecula. Australian robins are Petroica phoenicia. And, outside of a biological context, you can call these birds anything you want. There's no law that says you can't. But the scientific community, following these extremely boring rules, have agreed to standardize these names. And if you were to go down to Dr. McDonald in our department and do some research on American robins, well, eventually you might publish your results or you might talk about your results at a scientific meeting, and people could be there from all over the world. So you would want to use the name Turdus migratorius. That doesn't mean that everybody necessarily has that name memorized, but they would at least know where to look it up. No matter what language you speak, Turdus migratorius is what you would type into Wikipedia. Let's put it that way. That's a frame of reference that I know you all have. Except in a limited number of circumstances, binomial names can't be changed. There's a whole bunch of very boring rules as to exactly when you can and when you can't and how you have to go about doing it. That fish used to be the Atlantic slimehead. It's now called the orange roughy. Maybe tomorrow somebody's going to come up with something different to call it. But for the foreseeable future, it's going to be Hoplostethus atlanticus to people who study fish. By the same token, the Chinese gooseberry, which is now the kiwi fruit, has always been and probably will always be Actinidia deliciosa. For the record, you do not have to memorize any of these Latin names at all. I want you to see how the system works, but I'm never going to ask you, what is the scientific name of the kiwi fruit? I am not ever going to ask that. Oh, one more thing. Before I forget, I gave you a little bit of background detail into the life of Carl Linnaeus. All that I'm going to test you on, I would expect you to be able to recognize last names. And I would expect you to recognize what people did. It will help if you have some idea of who came first. So it might help if you remember that Linnaeus was working about 200 years before the people that discovered DNA. But the only thing I'm going to test you on might be last names and ideas. So I'm not going to ask you to remember that Linnaeus was born in 1707 or that he was a doctor at the University of Uppsala Medical School, or that he had an absolutely enormous ego and thought that God had put him on a mission. What you need to know is that Linnaeus came up with the system of biological nomenclature. And that's important because it's one that we still use. Names don't technically have to be in Latin. The leaves down there are the leaves of a tree that's native to China, but that's been introduced to many countries. In fact, we've got a couple growing outside this building, between this building and the baseball diamond. The leaves turn a really beautiful golden color in the fall. And I've seen others of these on Conway streets. You've seen them, whether you knew what you were looking at or not. That tree is called Ginkgo biloba, and ginkgo is derived from the Chinese name for it. That stripy fish, Abudephdus saxatilis. Saxatilis happens to be Latinized Greek for lives among the rocks. But Abudephdus is the Arabic name for it because it lives in places like the Red Sea, off the coast of what's now Yemen and Saudi Arabia, places like that. And the local Arabic-speaking fishermen have this name for it. It means father of stripes because it's a very stripy fish. Because it has a lot of stripes, the common English name for it is the sergeant major fish. The sergeant majors also have stripes. Right. So names don't have to be in proper Latin. There have even been people that have just made them up completely. My favorite was somebody who discovered a couple of new species of Australian wasp and put them in a genus called AHA, A-H-A, because he wanted to write a paper whose title would be AHA, a new genus of Australian wasp. The people who describe and name new species, many of them are really too easily amused. If he said if he ever found another genus, he was going to name it Oh No, so he could write a paper titled Oh No, another new genus of Australian wasp, but he never got to do it. Anyway, you have to be able to spell these names and pronounce them in the Latin alphabet. and you have to follow some extremely boring grammar rules that we don't need to get into for our purposes here. Names also have to be unique. If I found another species and called it Abu Defduf without knowing that that fish was already Abu Defduf, we'd have a conflict, and there'd be some rules for which name has to be changed and which one stays. So names have to be unique, not like human names where, there's probably a whole bunch of John Smiths running around. Names are not necessarily descriptions. And again, human names work the same way. Presumably, I had some ancestor way back when who drove a wagon, and they knew him as, I don't know, Fritz the Wagoner or something like that. And his name got handed down to his descendants and ultimately to me. I've never driven a wagon before. I've hardly ever been on a horse, much less hitched up horses to a wagon and driven a horse-drawn wagon. We're not Amish. Doesn't matter. That's my name. And it doesn't really matter what it means. It's basically just a string of sounds that identifies me and my family. And it's the same for biological names. They're not necessarily descriptions. That's the European swift. It's a bird that spends a huge amount of time in the air, very acrobatic, picking insects right out of the air, right as it's flying by. And it spends so much time in the air that it was once believed that it didn't have any feet. It actually does have feet. They're not real big, and they're kept tucked under very tightly, but it does have feet. The name means no foot in Latinized Greek. Apus means no foot. But it does have feet, and it doesn't matter because the name is simply a description. The name is not a description. The name is just a name. The fact that the name is not an accurate description of the bird is of no more significance than the fact that I don't actually drive wagons. Okay, with me there. Just a little bit, the describer of a new species does get the right to name it. It's kind of in poor taste to name it after yourself, although it has happened. But describers might name species in honor of others. So that guy was a missionary who also collected plants in Asia. He was German. His name was Georg Kamel. In Latin, the name becomes Georgius Camellius. And he sent back some of the first specimens of an Asian plant that has beautiful flowers, and Linnaeus named it in his honor. That's Camellia. Anybody heard of camellias? Don't know how many of you have gardens, but they are the kind of thing you can plant around here. They're popular as ornamental flowers. You can go by the plant outlet and put some in your backyard if you want to. Maybe not now, but once it warms up. A couple more that you might know. Caspar Wistar was an American physician and scientist back in the early days of the United States. And some friend of his named a plant called wisteria in his honor. Scottish botanist named Robert Forsyth got forsythia named in his honor. And again, I picked those because you can see them around here. They're popular ornamental plants. Forsythia in particular grows all of those yellow flowers, and it's one of the first flowers that you'll see in spring. Drive around older neighborhoods of Conway and you'll see a lot of yards, including mine, with forsythia. The yellow flowers are quite attractive in March. As I've said, it's one of the first spring flowering plants that we see. And wisteria is also popular as a garden plant. My mom had some in the backyard when I was growing up. You'll see it around Conway if you look for it. It has those hanging heads of beautiful purple flowers. So everything from camellias and wisterias and forsythias. Oh, the American ambassador to Mexico back in the early 1800s discovered a beautiful Mexican flower and introduced it to the United States. His name was Joel Poinsett. Anybody heard of poinsettias? Right? Those Christmas flowers. Yeah, though that's a genus name that was named in his honor. So some of these names come from patrons of science or friends of the describer, or sometimes enemies. Linnaeus had a bit of a vicious streak. People who he loved got beautiful flowers named after them. He was really good friends with another Swedish guy named Olaf Rudbeck, so he named Rudbeckia after him. And Rudbeckia is what you might call black-eyed Susan. It's a wildflower that you'll see in the summer around here. And then people he didn't like got weeds named after them. Linnaeus could be kind of a jerk, but he was on a mission from God. That's the important thing, I suppose. Right. Oh, the tradition continues to this day. On the left, that is a fly native to Australia, named in 2011. The fly has an unusually perfectly round posterior that is reflective in gold. So it has a perfectly round and golden behind. So it's Scatia biancea. The discoverer named it in honor of Beyonce. Over there on the right, that's a moth that is focused on the US-Mexico border. Has a strange growth of golden hair-like scales coming out of its head, and also has smaller genitalia than other related moths. And the discoverer opted to name it Neopalpa Donald Trumpi. I will let you decide whether that's funny or not. I'm simply reporting that you can name new species after almost anything you want to, and some people have pretty weird senses of humor when it comes to that. Here's how weird it gets. That's a fossil, and I found the first specimen of it on an expedition to Arctic Russia, north of a city called Arkhangelsk, all the way back in 1994. And my colleague, Andrei Ivansov, named it as a new species of fossil organism a couple of years after I'd left, and he very kindly named it Yorgia wagoneri. So yeah, there is fossil, species can sometimes be named after total non-entities. If they can name it after me, they can name it after anyone. And the really cool thing that I love is we still don't know what type of animal it is. So I got something named after me and nobody has any clue as to what that is. And I could not be more honored getting an absolute anatomical weirdo named after myself. I love it. Okay, right. It is now 10:47. Have you got any questions? All right, I will stop recording if I can remember how to do this.